Welcome to the first talk of Gotland Game Conference 2025, which is actually a workshop with our esteemed alumnus Clément Pirelli, who has been a student here and comes back every year, not only for Gotland Game Conference, but as a tutor, as a coach, as a peer, and as a great help to the department and to our students. And now you're here again, giving even more of your experience.
Yes.
And he is going to lead a workshop with you on how to get a programming job.
Exactly.
And, I will just hand it over to you. A very big hand for Clément.
Thank you. Yeah, great to see you all here. Big turnout actually, more than I expected, so that's very good. So today I'll be talking to you about getting a programming job. It's a workshop in the sense that I'm going to give you a presentation now, and then later on you'll have a one-to-one with me if you schedule it during the conference. And then we can do the applied part. So who am I? That's kind of important. I'm a game design and programming alumni. I graduated here in 2020. That's 5 years ago, which makes me a bit old. I am a software engineer at EA Frostbite. I work on their UI framework, basically designing and implementing stuff like UI and SES, which is kind of cool. I helped ship Total War Warhammer 3 beforehand at Creative Assembly. That was around 3 years ago. And during all of these, all this experience, I had a hand in recruiting mostly junior employees, and mostly for programming. So the structure of this talk. I'll be first telling you about how programmers are recruited, then about CVs and how one might go about writing them, building an effective portfolio, and finally following up with interviews and what they are, how you can get prepared for them. So how are programmers recruited? This is a pretty important step because it kind of lays the foundation for the rest. And I'll talk to you first about the process. So the usual process starts with you, of course. It starts with your application, right? Usually what I see juniors do is that they will read an application and decide, am I good enough for it, right? And I would really recommend you don't do that. So basically, instead of saying, am I good enough for it? You would think rather, do I want to do this, right? Do I want to do this job? And if you do, just apply. It doesn't matter if it says 5 years of experience, right? You probably won't get it. Oh well, you probably won't get all the stuff that you applied to anyways. So just apply and see how it goes. It's their job to then see if you match the qualifications. And what I see a lot of people doing is that they apply first, somewhere, let's say EA, and they don't get the job. They get a very nice rejection letter, and they feel a bit despondent, and they'll never apply to EA again, right? I think that it comes from kind of like a thought of like, okay, well, they've already rejected me, so I can't really go back. But that's really not the case. Basically, if you do apply again, it kind of shows that you're determined to get a job there, especially if you apply to the same positions or the same kinds of positions. It shows that you're interested, that you've maybe grown in between the two. And you can kind of show that in your application material as well. And the final thing that I see some people do, this is fairly rare these days, is that some people will just apply to one application at a time. And that really doesn't work because usually you don't even get a response until like 2 weeks later, right? So in those 2 weeks, you could have applied to a lot of jobs. So just apply to many at the same time, see what comes back, That doesn't mean lower the quality of your applications. That does mean like you shouldn't just wait for an answer before you go to somewhere else. It's not a sign of loyalty. There's no bad thing from a recruiter's perspective about an applicant who has applied to many places. Then after you've applied, there's a triage step. So usually it's someone called a recruiter. So it's probably an internal recruiter, which means basically non-technical staff that is only around to basically look at portfolios, look at CVs, try to find the right person for the right job. It might get skimmed by them, or it might get skimmed by ATS, which is basically a system to find keywords in applications and kind of triage by that. Sadly, it's getting more and more kind of done. It's since the 90s basically. it's a bit of a sad step, but we'll talk about how to kind of ATS-proof your CV after that. You'll get probably, or well, sometimes you get a take-home test, so something that you have to do on your own, and then maybe either you get like automatically graded, right? So it kind of like reduces the amount of work that they have to do, or it'll be part of the interviews later on if you're selected to like talk about what you did. And sometimes there's a triage call, meaning that someone from HR, a recruiter, maybe a people manager, will look at your CV, think, okay, this person might be a fit, get you in for a call, and then see, right? And it's usually not a very interesting experience, I suppose. It's more about like, do you understand what the position is about? Do you understand what the job, where the job is, all the logistical stuff, do you have the right to work here, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not, it's just a triage call. And after that, someone with more technical skills will take a deeper look. So they'll actually look at like more of who are you individually, and maybe they'll call you for an interview then. Yes, and then if you are good with the interviews, they'll give you an offer and ta-da, you got a job. So the first thing to know about recruiting is that it's very hard, both for you and for the employers. Basically, it's an inherently inaccurate and extremely biased practice. There's no science around it. It's basically kind of a lot of kind of received knowledge and guesstimates, I guess. So there's a lot of bias with it. And that means bias for example, who you are, your identity might come into play, sadly, because, even if we are not, inherently bigoted, we might have a bias about how other people are just by their name, by their appearance, their gender identity, stuff like that. Of course, it's illegal to, reject someone based on that, but it can also play kind of like a subconscious part, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. For junior positions, it's an especially hard thing to do, to recruit. There's so many applicants. I mean, especially these days, it's a very tough industry right now to get a job because the industry is basically flooded with applicants, right? And there's only ever one applicant for a position, right? That'll get selected. And you can't interview everybody because you don't have time as the employer. You can't even really look at everybody. Sometimes, there'll be like a time limit of like maybe a week after the position has been posted where they'll actually look at the CVs because there's just too many, right? Like if you have 700 applicants, even after the triage step, there's too many. There's no experience in a CV for a junior position, right? You're not supposed to have experience, you're a junior, right? So that means that it's kind of inherently hard to guess whether you're good for the position or not, right? What you're recruiting for in a junior is not experience. It's not really technical skills, right? You're expecting to teach them the technical skills that they need, but you're recruiting for passion, you're recruiting for potential, and you're recruiting for team fit. So passion as in, is this person going to, give their all? Potential as in, will this person grow, right, from where they are to where they're supposed to be as the person who is going to do that position in a non-junior level? And then team fit is like basically, you kind of want the person that you're working with to be nice, to have people skills, to not misunderstand everything, but also to not be, very like maybe a very unpleasant person to work with. So those three are kind of like the main pillars that all like recruiting for junior positions is kind of based on. Of course, the methodology, right, even what I just said, varies widely based on each place. You can think of these slides and what I'm telling you right now as, kind of like an industry perspective, but not the industry perspective. Often, when you look at the application process at a certain company, I've only seen a few, but it's often very bloated as a process. People kind of try to add steps to make it a more fair or a more accurate process, but really adding steps often doesn't really do anything to the accuracy. Often it's quite arbitrary. You might get a job because you had a bit of luck. You might not get a job because you didn't, right? And often like the questions that are asked might not be very good. So all of that kind of goes into why recruiting is quite hard, both for you and for the employer. Okay, so now that I've talked about recruiting, we can go on to CVs. So what is a CV? It's a curriculum vitae, which means a path of life. It's basically the highest level overview of what you have done in your career, or in your case, in your studies, in your personal life, to get this job, right? Usually it's a very dry, formal, and skimmable document. You want it to be quite skimmable because, as I said, the recruiters will basically just skim through. I'd really recommend using something like flowcv.io for a good structure for your CV, and also for a very good editing experience. We'll talk a little bit more about editing later, but it's very important to be able to quickly spin up a CV, basically. CVs are very tough to write when you're starting out because you have no experience, as I said, right? Basically, your question might be like, what do I write here? I mean, I don't have a job that I can just put in there. And it's a pretty hard topic, and therefore I've dedicated a slide to it. So basically, you're not expected to have any professional experience, but if you can get an internship, or even just a ship project, they're pretty great to show that you have the skills that are needed for the position, right? For example, I was very lucky when I was around here as a student to have the opportunity to work at a startup that was not game related, but just a startup that was making a product called FarmUp, which is still around actually, which kind of catapulted my career because suddenly I had some experience of any kind, right? And that kind of like is important to show that okay, you've got these skills. These ship projects, you can think of it as maybe a student game, a passion project, but ship it in the sense, like in the traditional sense of the word, like on Steam. Steam is seen as a kind of like a legitimate place compared to, for example, itch. Put some nice pictures there and just say like, hey, I have this game on Steam, right? It's not a bad thing, especially if it kind of picks up. I mean, you might not get that much interest in your game, but maybe a few reviews. That's already pretty good, right? You could put relevant courses in your CV, right? So, for example, you might be applying to an AI programmer position. Well, you've probably done an AI course, right? You've probably done a few AI courses if you're interested in the subject. So you can very much put that in your CV as like, hey, this was relevant. We did this in this course, and show it like that. There is some overlap between the portfolio and the CV in the sense that you can show your personal projects also in the CV, right? If you've made some really cool stuff, just show it, right? Like, hey, I made this, I don't know, A-star dwarf simulation or whatever, stuff like that, and show like a small blurb about like which skills you practiced during this personal project, right? You learned about A-star, you learned about et cetera, et cetera. That also kind of tricks the ATS system, right? This like automatic, filtering. Basically, if you show the skills that you have in these sections, the ATS will pick up on like, okay, A-star, behavior trees, blah, blah, blah. And they've probably filled out these kinds of systems with like these kinds of keywords just to see like, okay, do they have any experience in them? So it's pretty good to show these skills in the portfolio, in the CV, sorry. And yeah, it's kind of a show don't tell, right? If you have a project and you mention the skills that you acquired during this project, it's much better than just saying, I have this skill, right? So a very good example is like C++. A lot of people put C++ on their CV, but it doesn't really mean anything because you can be a very good C++ developer or you can be a complete beginner and nobody knows, right? We'll talk a tiny bit more about that in a second, but showing something you made with C++ lets me as the recruiter or the technical staff kind of understand, oh, okay, they're at this level. Okay, they were able to make like a ray tracer in C++, that's already pretty good. So, common feedback I give during CVs review. A lot of the common mistakes are fairly simple to palliate. Lots of people will put, for example, in C++, right? They'll put like, I have 80% C++, right? Or something like that, with like a skill bar or something. And it's kind of like a easy image to have in your head of like, a skill of a character in an RPG or whatever, but it doesn't really translate super well to real life, because what does 80% C++ mean, right? I don't think I'm at 80% C++. I don't think most people are at 80% C++. Maybe it's 80% C++ for a junior, in which case, well, okay, that's not 100%. Why, right? So it doesn't really mean anything. You can interpret it in any way you want. So rather show your skills. Like, I made this with C++, and therefore I, as the person who's looking at your CV, can from that interpolate or extrapolate rather what your skills actually are, where you are with your skills. A lot of people have a GitHub link in their CV. That's a really good idea. But a lot of people have a GitHub link that then shows an empty GitHub or a GitHub with a bunch of projects that have nothing written about them, right? That's kind of worse than not having a GitHub link, because basically you will click on it and get disappointed, right? As the recruiter. Because you're not going to be able to have the time to dig into the code. Like, nobody's ever going to do that, really. So what you want is to have either no GitHub link or a GitHub link which is basically like a small annex to your portfolio even, with lots of detailed write-ups, lots of pictures. This is what I made. You can go pretty far with that, actually, and make a really cool GitHub if you put in a bit of effort in there. A lot of people will have an introduction in their CV, and usually it'll sound a bit like, my name is Clément Pirelli. I'm a passionate and resourceful programmer interested in graphics programming and UI. I am very good at talking with other people and worked with lots of teams. That is on every CV, essentially, and it's not really necessary. I think you can get all of that from the rest of the the CV. The passion can be evident through what you've made. Your team fit can be also evident through who you've made it with. So you don't need this kind of like introduction like that. And of course, this is my feedback. Some people might tell you otherwise. A mistake that I didn't put here, actually, that I should have, is putting a picture in your CV. As I mentioned, sadly, everybody has some kind of like unconscious or implicit bias. And a picture is a very good way to make sure that that bias is activated, right? I mean, for example, me as who I am, I have a bias towards Europeans. Like, I know that this is the case, and I try to go against it and say, okay, well, I'm just going to ignore this part of my brain that's telling me these stupid things. But you might have a bias towards people who went to Uppsala University, for example. I have a bias like that because I know that this university is great, right? I know that, okay, these people have probably done these courses, and I know them better than someone who would go to, I don't know, Chalmers or something, right? But it doesn't mean that the people from Chalmers are worse. So we all have these biases from where we come from and stuff like that. And a picture is a great way to kind of make that come to the surface. Same with the name. A lot of people will, at companies, will anonymize CVs. So they will basically make it so that the CV doesn't have a name, doesn't have a picture, doesn't have any information about maybe where you went to university even. And that way you kind of like get rid of all these biases. You can, as the recruiter and the technical staff, kind of look at the CV in an unbiased way. But then of course there's the portfolio, which kind of shows all of that as well. So it's pretty tough to anonymize. In any case, for stuff that you should do, you should put a clear timeline of the stuff you've done and when you've done it, right? And the way you can leverage that is by basically showing growth, right? Like, first I made, again, I'll go with the AI programmer example. First I've made, an A-star project as part of a course, and then I did, my own project with behavior trees using the A-star, and then I put goal-oriented action planning instead of the behavior trees to make it look cooler. Those are like 3 projects or whatever, and they're in a clear timeline, in a clear sequence that shows very good growth, as an AI programmer. So it shows that potential and that passion. You should put overviews for everything. So you can put overviews for your jobs, or internships or whatever. You can put overviews for your projects, for your student games. just basically showing what you learned as the skills, you know, what you did in like kind of like short term. And maybe the biggest piece of advice I can give you is tailoring. And I made a whole slide about it. Basically, job applications, as you see on the right there, have must-haves, right, like qualifications, blah, 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 and then they have nice-to-haves. What a recruiter does when they're skimming is that they look at those must-haves and nice-to-haves, they look at your CV, and they compare. Okay, they have 3 of those and 2 of those. That's good, right? Or they have 0 of the must-haves. Well, okay, they're probably not going to get the job. And they triage based on that. What you can do to take advantage of this, right? They literally show you what they want. Basically make a master CV with everything you've got, right? So you put all of your, maybe, I don't know, you're interested in AI and gameplay programming. Put all of your AI programming stuff in there, put all of your gameplay programming stuff in there, put everything you've ever done in there, really. And make it like as detailed and as interesting as it can be. And then per job application, you can make a new CV and grab stuff from the master CV. It takes very little time. You're basically just copy-pasting stuff, right? And you're grabbing it based on this filtering, right? Like, what would be the best to show them for this application, right? And it's not cheating. I mean, you know, it's just showing them what they want to see, right? And it's a really, really important step to do. Recruiters will absolutely love you, right? They'll see exactly what they've got on their list in your CV, and they'll just, okay, this guy or person gets, you know, gets further in the steps, right? That's probably the most important bit. And if you're getting no interviews, this is probably what will help you the most, because often people, what they fail at is the triage step, not really necessarily afterwards with the technical staff. Okay, now we can talk about building an effective portfolio. So a portfolio is a collection of past work, whereas the CV was basically what you've done in quick collection. A portfolio will showcase what you've done as projects. So you can have lots of pictures, lots of stuff like that. That's pretty good to look at, like an overview of your project. These days, a portfolio is almost always a website. I would really recommend not using a PDF because you want to be able to click stuff, and we'll talk about that in a bit. It doesn't matter what you use, as long as it's readable, basically. Portfolios basically help everyone involved, right? We talk about the perspective of the recruiter, we talked about the perspective of the technical staff, and your perspective. They help all three. So from the recruiter's perspective, they want a summary, right? They want something skimmable. They can't dig through code. They can't understand technical explanations, really. The CV is good, right? It's like what most of them will look at. But sometimes they will also try to look at the portfolio just to get an idea of who you are a bit more. And sometimes the CV is too brief, right, on some details. They want to know more. Sometimes it's too technical, like, oh, I don't really know what GOP is, right? I want to see more of that, right? They have very little time for each application. And the portfolios will basically give them a high-level overview of you as a candidate. What you've done, you know, where your passion lies, whether the job fits you, and it will show them something that is kind of, yeah, it's funny that it works, but pictures, you know, they're great. You can show them, for example, in my portfolio that I had when I got my job at Creative Assembly, I had a picture of a ray-traced dragon, right? It's a very simple, what's it called, thing to make. But everybody who I talked to at that company, during my you know, interviewing steps, was like, oh, you're the dragon guy, right? Because they just remembered this image. It's much easier to remember an image, or even better, a GIF, right? Because it has movement and catches your eye, than words on a page, right? From the technical perspective, it gives a very good overview of your soft and hard skills by basically showing what you've done. Again, you know, the show don't tell. So, you know, you might have some, you know, quick introduction to a portfolio piece that says, you know, I worked on this game with a team of 7, etc. All of those, you know, they show stuff about you that you might put also in the CV, but you might put more detail in the portfolio because you have more room, basically. In a portfolio, you essentially have infinite room. It gives them interesting technical details, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, why that's important. And it gives insight into all those three important areas that I talked about. Passion, potential, and team fit. And finally, the portfolios help you a lot. They're a very good refresher for your own memory. I don't know about you, but my memory is pretty, not that great for that kind of stuff, like what did I do, why did I do it, etc. Before an interview, before you apply to a position, you can just reread your portfolio and get a refresher for yourself. But it also sets your own terms for the interview questions. I talked about technical details. Well, they might ask you about them, and that's great. The more topical a question, the easier it is to answer, because you know that stuff, you've done it. If you're asked like, tell me about a time when you had a problem in Unity. Well, that's a pretty tough question to answer because you might not remember a time, right? But then you might not know how to explain it. If you've got, oh, I see that you did this in Unity. How did you handle that problem? Well, you did that work, right? So you will be able to answer that question. So it's basically a freebie for you, right? You won't have this like blank or this stress from getting a question that you can't answer, right? Yes. For these perspectives, I recommend making 2 layers to your portfolio. You can see them on the left there. So you've got the introductory layer, which shows kind of like an image and the title and a little bit of text, and then the more essay. I mean, this is just a tiny bit because this is a slide after all. To show more detail. So the high-level overview is all a recruiter needs. They'll never click on any of these items, right? Because probably they can't even understand what you wrote because they're not technical. It shows them nice pictures. Again, it's a very important point. And for the technical staff, it kind of gives them like a launchpad into your projects. Oh, I want to know more about Vulkan deferred renderer and SSAO or whatever, and they'll click on them. So for that, you need to have like a detailed write-up, a click away, which gives questions for the interviews and gives memorable details that they can latch onto for interview questions. For your portfolio, I think it's very important to also think of it as a kind of like a story. So you know how in a series you have like maybe episodes that are a little bit disjointed, but you always have a red thread, right? That kind of cuts through all the stories. So pick a direction with your portfolio, right? And stick to it. So basically, you can show work going in that direction. Maybe, for example, you want to be an AI programmer. Well, show work that implements AI algorithms, that uses maybe APIs that are already available for AI, game AI, that uses these engines that are often used for that stuff. Show interactions that AI programmers would have with non-technical people, right, to show that team fit. And basically, you want the portfolio to have a story that is always unfinished, of course, because you're still around. And the next chapter is the job that you're applying to, right? And it's pretty important for the technical staff, right? Because they're kind of looking at who will be my next teammate, basically, right? And if you can show like, okay, basically, my feet have grown until I can get into these boots, that you're laying in front of me. It's great because you can really get through to them and basically almost convince them before the interviews, okay, this is already a pretty good candidate. Which leads me to the meta trademark, which is basically start making side projects now. Of course, you're all from different years, or maybe you're not even at the university, since this is an open talk. But making side projects, your portfolio is only as good as the project that you show in it. You can't make, out of nothingness. And Uppsala University gives you a lot of time outside of courses, and that time you can use to your liking. A lot of people use it in a lot of ways, but I would really recommend using it for making projects. It can be with other people, it can be on your own, but just try to think about where your effort lies, right? Like, where do you put your effort? Don't just think about, okay, it would be cool if. That's a good first step, but then add like a bit of a triage afterwards. Like, does this align with where I want to go, right? If I want an AI programmer job, maybe it wouldn't be a great idea to do some gameplay programming, right? If you have existing projects, it takes way less time to polish a project than to make a new one, right? So if you see that on your portfolio, there's stuff like, this one could be a bit better, well, just do it, right? It doesn't take too much time, and the more polished your portfolio is, the more impressive it is. And you have a bunch of work that you've done, you can build on top of that, right? It's, again, much easier to make a very impressive portfolio piece if you're building on top of previous work, right? For example, what I did was basically, first I implemented a ray tracer on the CPU that was a little bit ugly, I suppose, and not very performant and all that, because I didn't really know much about that. Then I implemented a ray tracer that was a bit better, following a book, and actually, implemented these algorithms that are pretty interesting. And then went towards, okay, well, I really want to do graphics programming, but most of it is not ray tracing, so let's use a graphics API, right? So I kind of like stepped from stone to stone across the water in a way. I didn't end up getting a graphics programmer job, right? But my portfolio was still extremely impressive because these projects built on top of each other. So even if you're thinking, well, I don't really want to specialize too much, going in a direction helps in any case. Yes. So write-ups. What you should do is structure it as an essay, basically. So you have a conclusion, which basically says what you learned from this, and an introduction, which says, what it is, essentially, in a short amount of words. And then in the middle, you've got like kind of the meat, which is basically, what challenges you faced, what solutions they had, bunch of pictures, bunch of stuff. And it can be really good to, for example, use diagrams for your code. Even just, of course, it always has to kind of be relevant, but showing diagrams is great because often we use diagrams in the industry just to kind of show ideas. And if you can show that, okay, I can explain my work to you in a pretty eloquent way, that fits into that team fit, right? Because if you're gonna work with other people, you're gonna have to explain code to them, right? At some point. And the write-up can also be a place where you can showcase that skill. Common mistakes are for the write-ups to be game pitches. So a lot of the time I see a portfolio where there's basically an image and a title of a game, and then you click and it gives you an itch page where that game can be downloaded, right? And that's fine in the sense that, okay, you have made a game, right, and it's pretty cool. You should put the itch page or the Steam page somewhere. But you're not showing what you learned from it, right? You're not showing the details of the implementation. You're not showing what you did on this game. You're showing just the final result. I would really suggest instead basically showing, making that essay and making a detailed write-up that you can show people. It takes some work, right? But actually this work is, it's fairly simple compared to what you get out of it, right? If you think about it like, if you apply to a bunch of jobs and you have like a 0.1% chance of getting the job, you would rather work a bunch and then have a 0.2%, right? It's already double, right? Or whatever. So, do the effort and put the effort in to not only have a game pitch and also not only have basic facts. Really show analysis because, again, you're showing that you're kind of like thinking about these things, that you're in a way that you're smart, basically. And yeah, the last one is kind of a funny one that I see sometimes, not very often, but don't blame your team members in your write-ups or anything like that because it's just not a very good idea. People essentially end up thinking that they don't want to work with you and therefore they won't give you a job. That's also the team fit, right? For logistical concerns, I would recommend putting a link to your CV in your portfolio and vice versa. Basically, people will often send each other material. So they might send someone a CV and the person is like, oh, I would like to see their portfolio. Well, now they can't. They have to ask the person again, right? Or look at your application in their software. So just put a link there. It's nicer. Overall, just make it simple to use, right? kind of like a frictionless experience there, again with that bias or whatever, kind of implies a frictionless experience with you. So no title that you need to scroll past. I see a lot of people putting like a hi and a little picture and a, you know, I'm this and I'm that before, and you have to scroll to get to the actual, you know, content. I'd really recommend against that, just so you can like first of all see what you've done when you get to the page. If you can, just avoid pop-ups. They're very irritating, and again, with bias, they kind of make a bad impression. And if you can, but this is like kind of an optional thing, make it readable on a phone or a small screen. Basically, yeah, any kind of portable device. People will often look at portfolios and CVs on the go. You know, it's kind of like a task that you can do in between big tasks that are more like technical. So people will not necessarily do them on their computer. And this is a huge one. Again, that leads to bias. We all have this bias. When someone writes a word and it's misspelled, we tend to think of them as less intelligent. This is not, of course, the case. I mean, there's people, for example, who are dyslexic, who are just as intelligent as others, or who don't speak the language natively. But it just is like that. People will tend to think of you as less smart if you are using worse English, essentially. So use a spell checker. Ask a friend to reread all your stuff and just like point out mistakes. It takes very little time and it has a lot of impact. Now we can talk about interviews. So I'm not going to talk about the triage interview. It's honestly very boring. But the programmer interviews are kind of like where I see the most anxiety with applications. And so I thought it would be good to give kind of like an overview and how you can prepare for that and lessen that anxiety. Often it's more than one round. As I talked about before, they're kind of like the interviewing process can be fairly bloated with many interviewing steps. I think for my first job, which was at Creative Assembly, I had 3 interviews. So yeah, quite a lot. They're usually split into 2. They can be mixed, but there's one part which is behavioral questions, which is essentially the intent is to understand how you will behave in a certain situation, maybe a stressful situation, maybe a social situation where there's a conflict. You know, how did you handle a conflict with a team member or whatever? That would be the question. They're fairly challenging for the interviewee to respond to, and they're fairly inaccurate for the interviewer to to ask, because it can be very hard to remember and then very hard to explain a situation just off the top of your head, right? You know what you can do for that. We'll talk about it in a second. But we've already talked about you know, putting stuff in your portfolio that kind of gives them ammunition for questions, right? And how that helps you. For technical questions, the intent is to understand how you think and what you know on a specific subject. So it can be, for example, on C++, it can be on a certain algorithm, it can even be like a whiteboard question. For example, you know, I don't know, I might have like a whiteboard and I draw a grid on it and I tell you, well, how would you represent this grid if I have like units and I need to move around in it, right? And you might give an answer, and then maybe I make it more complicated later and I say, well, okay, what if the grid is infinite now? Right? How would you make that? They're challenging for you to answer, of course. I mean, that's kind of their nature as a question that has a technical side. And they're fairly inaccurate because you might not know a detail, or you might have forgotten a detail. You might be blanking on the answer. And we'll talk about how to kind of fix that. Yeah. One big part of interviews is nerves. You know, interviews are very stressful, and everybody knows this, basically, even the interviewers. So they'll kind of try to make you as confident and as comfortable as you can be, because in a normal situation where you'll be working at their company, you won't be, you know, extremely stressed and extremely anxious, right? So they want to see how you work in an actual situation, not just in an interview. If you can't answer a question, what I see and what I've seen a lot is that interviewees tend to like collapse, basically. They start to panic. And they might push through that panic, which is good, but you don't really need to panic. What I would say is instead, try to, when you don't know the answer, talk about your thought process until you get to I don't know, right? You might think, like for example, for the example I gave before with the grid and making it infinite, you might not really realize like, oh, I can chunk this, right? You might think, well, okay, I was using a vector before, but a vector can't hold an infinite amount. And even then, like, yeah, I really wouldn't really know what to do there. And maybe the interviewer can say, well, yeah, but you know, how do you think Minecraft does it, right? Or something like that. And you might think, oh yeah, they have chunks, so I can continue on my thought process. And they've unblocked me, right? They help you out, not necessarily because you know, they're just nice, but also because they want to see your thought process. That's what they're caring about. They don't care about the answer, right? They know the answer. So what they care is your thought process, your reaction to the answer, to the question, and how you think about the getting to the solution. And you can get calm or calmer through practice. Try to ask questions, you know, to another friend, right? Like back and forth. Like it can be behavioral questions, it can be technical questions, and try to like mock interview. That's a very easy thing you can do with a friend. You know, you can find interview questions online maybe, or just ask stuff you're curious about on another friend's project. And that can get you to be calmer because you've already done it once. You can also use lead code. I would really recommend against what's called grinding lead code, which is basically you use lead code over and over and over again until you know a lot of questions. I think that's kind of useless because the point of an interview is not to answer the question. It's kind of to, or not to get to the answer. It's to kind of show the path you took to that answer. So if you can use lead code as kind of like a starting point for getting a problem, and then talk through your thought process about the problem, and when you're stuck, just Google, right? Okay, you know, I don't know this thing. Let me look at Google, because basically Google is, in this sense, is the interviewer, right, who has the knowledge about this question. You can then get a pretty good mimicry of what the interview will actually be like. And then, you know, of course, the night before the interview, you can look at your application material, think of questions that they might ask, think of what your answer would be, stuff like that. It all helps. So yes, that's about it. So what now? Well, book a one-to-one with me. There's the QR code right there. I know there's already someone who's booked for 3, so I look forward to seeing them there. Find a programming position you'd be interested in. Hopefully a junior position, but it's completely okay if it's not. Try to create or adapt your application material to that position, following, you know, the advice I gave in the slides. And then we'll look at it together and see where we can improve. If you don't have this, it's also fine to, you know, book a time and try to talk about like what you could have and stuff like that. But this is kind of the intended scenario where you, you know, kind of the workshop part where you apply this, these slides, and then we look at it together. Okay, I will leave it on this for a second just so you get the QR, and then I will go to questions. Also, I would hope that these slides are available to you in some way. I think I was talking to Pelle before about putting them on the fancy new thing that you have available to you. Back then it used to be Slack, but I think you don't use that anymore. So yes, that, whatever that is, it'll be available to you. Studium, yes, thank you. And here's some resources that I put in the slides. So this is an article I wrote after GGC 2023 when I gave a lot of feedback to a lot of people, and I thought, well, you know, I'll just write it down. It's pretty much a summary of what I said here, but there's maybe some new stuff, maybe, yeah, I think I basically talk about it here, but maybe interesting to you. And this is an archive link to the portfolio I had when I first got my job at Creative Assembly, when I was just, actually I was in my 3rd year as a bachelor's here. So yes, any questions?
I think it's pretty typical for people to showcase some tutorial that they finished. You know, they basically just watched a video and wrote it down. What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, it can be a little bit disappointing, I suppose, but also I think it's a good starting point. Like, I wouldn't say like don't use tutorials because they're pretty great. Like, for example, the path tracer that I wrote for my portfolio was based on a book called Ray Tracing in One Weekend. It's a very simple book to follow. But then, you know, instead of just saying, here's the result, because you could literally just copy paste, you know, the tutorial, build on top of that, right? It can be a really good starting point for a very interesting project, right? So you start with, for example, I mean, I'm going to go with the path tracer because it's a good example, but you know, you could implement some new lighting algorithms, right, that aren't in that book. Or you could think, well, how do I make it faster, right? And then showcase that. Like, I looked at it with a profiler, and I found that, you know, it was spending most of its time in pointer indirections. So I, you know, removed the unique pointers and made it a big flat array, stuff like that. You know, like very simple stuff that you can do in not that much time, actually, and end up with like, oh, they went the extra mile. They didn't just make this tutorial and just leave it at that. They kind of were interested in this enough to kind of, you know, do more, basically. If you don't have projects right now, right, that can be a really good, like, fast track to having some cool stuff. Basically finishing a tutorial and then starting there with the project that is actually yours. Yeah. Thank you. Yes? Oh, just a second. I think you need to wait for the...
Thank you. What about the experience that is related to like game development, but not necessarily programming experience? Like I have experience with like sound design and things like that. Is that like in terms of like, is that a good advantage in terms of like a team fit or?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think in a technical sense, like it would be maybe less interesting, but at the same time, like, first of all, definitely put like your career path in your curriculum vitae. I said, you know, make a master's and then kind of take the parts that are interesting, right? But you do want to have like an overview of your previous experience if you have any. I would say that, you know, be intentional about it. Kind of think before you put it in, like, what will this show? If you do that, you're basically better than most applications, right? You can even think like, okay, this will give me a good overview of like some work that I did with other people, right? And that's perfectly good. Like, that's a really good reason to put it in. But just have a reason. Yes. Thank you.
Do you remember using any of the career services at the university while you were here?
Well,
Yeah.
we didn't really have the internship course. I think I would really recommend that one.
Yeah, yeah.
If you can, enroll in the internship course, get an internship. I mean, this is like a very simple, or I wouldn't say it's simple, but straightforward, I would say, way to get some experience and to kind of like, kind of shine above. Otherwise, I don't think I did use any of that stuff. I kind of, I looked outside of Sweden as well, and I kind of looked through, yeah, maybe that's something I didn't talk about is how you look for applications. You know, these days there's a lot of like aggregating sites that just show you all the applications for all the companies, and you can filter by those. I know that when I actually searched, I used this thing called Game Dev Map, which basically shows you a map of the world. You can click on each location, and it shows you the game development studios in that location. But it doesn't really show you their positions. It just shows you, like, there's a studio there. Then you have to click and look at their positions yourself. It was okay, but yeah, I didn't really use any of the more, I suppose, academic help or something like that.
Yeah. Well, then I just want to tell
Yes.
the audience that there is Career
please.
Gate, and it actually follows all of your tips.
Awesome.
So there's career counselors that you can book one-on-one, and then there is a database, Career Gate. It's for all of Europe. And they have all sorts of advertisements, but if they don't have a particular advertisement, they also have like a profile over the company.
Okay,
so
cool.
it's a good start. It's for alumni too. I can see some alumni here, so alumni can go in. But the other question I had was about, you said no experience, But this group, I mean, you know the education, they really do have some, I mean, rather
you're
than
right.
high schoolers, I mean, because you probably get high schoolers looking
Yeah.
for jobs and, you know, they probably, don't you really think that this group kind of does have something?
The thing is, like, yeah, you're not really competing with high schoolers. I think what you're competing with is vocational educations, and those will have kind of like an internship as part of their, I suppose, their criteria for finishing the education. And in that sense, you're on an even scale with them. What I meant with experience was professional experience, like actually working at a game studio. And that's usually like, for example, my CV is fairly short. It basically says, I worked here, I worked there, here are my skills, right? It's usually enough, but you don't have that, you know, that possibility to basically just say, here, I did this cool thing, hire me. I mean, you don't have that, at least professionally. So that's mostly what I meant. But you're right that you have a lot of experience that you can show. For example, your student games like Vertical Slice and Arcade Game. Or if you're in Masters, you can also show your Master's work. Yep. Yep. Thank you for the questions. Anything else? Yes.
How has AI affected the industry and people looking for jobs?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, my perspective is fairly narrow, I would say, because I've only worked at, well, after, I guess, ChatGPT 3.0 came out, I've only worked at one company, so I only know their response to that. I would say definitely that we see a lot more CVs that have kind of like a tinge of AI in them, and it really depends on who you're talking to, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I would say that, for example, EA has been trying to push for AI quite a bit, but for example, an indie developer might see that as a negative thing, as in, oh, you're not creative, right? I would say that for your portfolio pieces, it's a pretty good idea to write the write-up yourself. Maybe you can use AI for ideas on how to write better, basically style, but not content. I would say there's a very big risk when you use AI that you stop learning, essentially, on your own. And for programmers, it's an extremely important skill to have, to be able to basically pick up something on your own, not have to look around, basically understand it yourself. And yeah, so there's some worries there. But overall, we're not at the point where it affects too much. I would say that economical problems are much more of an effect. I don't know if you know, but right now the industry is, the well has run dry in a way. You know, the infinite money glitch is no longer. So it affects every studio. It affects what job they have. So that's probably the biggest worries that your cohorts will have compared to AI. Yeah. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, if anybody has.
It's a spin-off.
Yeah.
I mean, are the companies using AI to look at CVs?
Are the companies
I mean, 'cause
using... Yeah.
the ATS that you mentioned,
Yes,
I mean,
so-
that's an AI tool, right?
So ATS is much more rudimentary than AI. It's basically a keyword searcher. It basically just splits the CV into like words and just looks to the words. So it's very simple. But actually, these days, there's more and more tools that basically do like ATS plus AI, essentially, for triage. I would say that in the games industry, AI is not being, and recruiting overall in the games industry is not as hellish as in other industries, in the sense that you will have another human on the line, often. I think companies will be using, will be using AI to triage at some point. For example, at EA, I don't believe that's the case. I actually don't know, but I don't believe that's the case. Honestly, I don't see what the point would be, because the the information that you have in a CV is already highly formatted and highly skimmable, and it's made like that by design. You don't really need a tool to tell you, to condense that information. The information is already very condensed. So I would say that I don't see it being an issue. Yeah. But thank you for the question. Cool. Well, I hope to see you in a one-to-one at some point during the convention. If you don't have time to work on your application material, that's perfectly fine as well. We can work on it together. And yeah, I wish you a great GGC.